Hello and welcome to yet another guitar channel. I'm Andrzej, and today we are going to be looking at power supplies. Now, power supplies may not seem like the most exciting of components for your pedal board, but they are one of the most important. Good, clean, consistent power is essential for low noise. So why am I doing this video? Well, quite simply because they sent me their newest Zeus power supply. And I thought it was a really good opportunity to look at power supplies in general, but also show you this one, explain why this one's really cool. Not just because they sent it to me, it is actually a really cool power supply, and I've had a lot. So let's go back to the beginning. You've got pedals on your board, and the majority of pedals can be powered by 9-volt batteries. So why would you want to power them with a power supply? A couple of simple reasons. First, small mini pedals don't tend to be powered by a battery, but also the more pedals you've got, the more batteries you need. 9-volt batteries are not cheap. It becomes very expensive and impractical. One runs out, you replace it, next one runs out, and so on. Also, the voltage isn't consistent in a 9-volt battery. It decreases over time. Now, this is something that's very sought after by certain fuzz aficionados, and something that the majority of lower end power supplies can't manage. I'll talk about how this one handles that in a bit. So what do you do next? Well, the next step up from taking batteries is getting a 9-volt power supply. Boss, I think probably the main ones you'll have seen around. Just a little a little transformer that plugs in, and then plug into the pedal, you have 9 volts of power. If you have more than one pedal, the likelihood is you will have something like this, which is a daisy chain lead. So your power supply goes in there, and then you can plug multiple effects into the daisy chain. So why would you do anything different? There are some inherent problems with daisy chaining effects. Whilst the power supply is fairly consistent, the wattage draw can be... Now, there are a few problems with doing this. You might be sat there going, well, why would I do anything other than daisy chain? The biggest problem is that modern high draw pedals, so digital pedals and that kind of thing, require a very consistent high ampage from their power supplies. And if your little 9-volt wall wart doesn't have enough, it just won't power everything properly. The other thing that happens is if you're linking all of the pedals together, all the power supplies, the pedals together into one big chain. And because each of those individual plugs isn't isolated, if something happens at one end, it can affect something at the other end. So a good example of this are high draw digital delay pedals. What you actually might find happening is when they're switched on and they have that little pulsing LED to show you what the tap tempo is, it can actually affect older analog pedals, which then start to actually pulse slightly. You can hear it in the pedal. Some older vintage pedals just won't work off a daisy chain power supply. There's too much noise because you get grounding loops, there's hums, all sorts of stuff that you just can't manage with a daisy chained set of effects. So that's where you start looking at the slightly more expensive. So that's where you start looking at some of the more expensive power supplies. Now, the next step up is often something like this. So you have, I think this one's 10 outputs. You have power supply comes in, usually a 12 or an 18. Now, the next step up from a daisy chain tends to be these slightly cheaper power supplies that look like this. So they're quite small. It's the size compared to standard pedal. They take usually a 12 or an 18 volt wall wart power supply in, and they give you fairly clean outputs. And also quite often they will have some extra sort of high output sockets as well. So this one has a 12 volt and an 18 volt output. And it has a couple that give you 500 milliamps. So if you've got higher draw pedals, you can power them off one end of this. Now, these are really good, but they still suffer from a very similar problem to daisy chaining, because actually inside most of these cheaper ones, it's really daisy chained. There are some filters in there to keep the power clean, and quite often the higher output ones are isolated from the rest of them. But it still means that you are connecting all of these pedals together by their power supplies. And you get a very similar issue to what I was talking about before, where one pulsing at one end can affect one at the other end. Some pedals don't like it, they generate noise off it. So again, it's a good step up. It does help you regulate the power supply, takes out some of the noise that you can get from the wall, but still not ideal. So that's when something like this comes in. Now, this is a big, chunky, reasonably expensive power supply. I'll put prices on the screen for all these various sort of options as I'm going along. However, it has lots of advantages. Now, one of them isn't size. I mean, it is a big unit. So if you're going to be using one of these, you need a proper pedal board for this, or you need to have it separate to the pedal board. But there are some advantages. Now, the first one being it's isolated, which means every single one of these outputs, and one of the big things is it's isolated. So each one of these outputs is isolated from each other. So you don't get this thing of one drawing power from the other and you're getting that pulsing and all that kind of stuff. It also means if there are any problems with one pedal, it doesn't affect all the other ones. And it just means that everything is cleaner. Each one reduces hum along the way, and it just makes the overall noise level of the board much lower. It also has some, I'm going to talk about some of the functionality, but some other practical advantages. First one is it uses a kettle lead rather than having to use one of those small little 9-volt plugins, barrels, which means that it's a much more solid connection. The number of times I've had one of these break on during a gig because the socket just got loose. So it's a much firmer connection. And it means all of the transformer and everything that's going on is on the inside here rather than being plugged into the wall. What else does this particular one do? Well, this one has a few extra clever little features. So first of all, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 standard 500 milliamp 9-volt outputs. 500 milliamps is enough to power most digital effects, and you only need 2 of those linked together to power, say, an HX Stomp. It also has 3 extra kind of variable output power supplies that can give you 9, 12, or 18 volts. At 9 volts is 500 milliamps, goes down to 300, then 200 as you go to 12 and 18 volts. So with this little flicky switch, you can change the voltage of these. So with this little flicky switch, you can change the voltage of these. Then finally, it's got a really cool little feature here where the last output is completely variable. So it has a little, you can see it on the camera there, now the final output on this is probably one of the coolest features on this, because it is a variable voltage output that takes you from 12 volts down to 6 volts with a little potentiometer here. So that turns. Now, what this means is if you have maybe an old fuzz or a phaser or something like that, which sounds better when you starve the voltage, going back to that idea of 9-volt batteries losing power and some fuzz people loving them, you can actually emulate this by just turning this down to 6 volts, and you can vary it and play with it until you get that sweet spot, which I think is a really cool little feature. And the final little feature on here is it has a USB output. So you can charge your phone off this or put a little light on it, whatever you want to. So you end up with 6 standard 9-volt outputs, 3 that you can vary between 18, 12, and 9, and 1 that you can vary between 6 to 12 with the sort of infinite variation in the middle. So all in all, you can power 10 pedals off this very comfortably with just one wall socket. As I'm supposed to be explaining what else makes this particular unit cool, it's built like a brick. This is all solid metal. It weighs more than most pedals, so it's a big solid unit. It comes with tons of leads of different lengths, allows you to jumper 2 of them to get higher milliamps into a effect like a stomp, and generally comes with everything you're going to need to put together the power on your pedal board. I've used a lot of power supplies. I currently on my main pedal board, I've been using a Harley Benton isolated power supply. This will probably replace it. Currently being used as my power supply for my demo rig. But it's likely to replace the pedal board version at some point, to be honest. It has tons of features, and it's a good option if you're looking for a higher end power supply. There is nothing wrong with a daisy chain power supply for knocking around at home. There is nothing wrong with one of these for knocking around at home, or even for gigging if you can just make sure you don't kick the input. But if you have any kind of noise or any kind of pedals that are reacting badly to having this sort of less regulated power supply, you're going to want to invest in a better power supply. And the Zeus is a good one. It does the job. It does the job well. I've got no qualms about having this on a pedal board and kicking it around a gig. So overall, a great option. But whatever you're doing, make sure you are using the best option for your setup and one that doesn't introduce noise into your pedal board and your setup. So once again, thank you to NUX for sending this over. I'll have links down below to the stuff that I've shown you, including this, for you to be able to go and buy and me get my little kickback off Amazon affiliates. Any questions, stick them in the comments below. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.